quickly. We said it's a book of sermons. There's 3 addresses by Moses to the people. It's only Moses that is speaking. And in between you will hear God speaking, but God mainly speaking to Moses. Now and then to the people, but mainly to Moses, and then Moses would then forward that message to them. So he's a preacher who's busy explaining what? What was he explaining to them?
What does Moses explain?
The commandments. Which commandment?
The 10.
The
first commandment, yes.
Mainly the first commandment. Because if you go right back to the introduction, it says God required his people should love him and serve him. Now, that is his call to his people. He owned the heavens and the earth, but chose to love the inclination. Like someone once said, God doesn't want us. He doesn't need us. He wants us. Yes, Moses preaches to them that he will sometimes with poison, and he will use an unsaved person to bring punishment. In this case, unsaved nations were called to punish the people. Dis as ons dink daai het gesê vergaan. It is the self, is the today the same forever. He doesn't change. Sometimes his methods may differ from one person to the next or one nation to the next, but ultimately it's the same thing. Discipline is discipline. But the same token, obedience is obedience, and that is what he calls you to. So, we move on to Unit 2, which is the conquest of the land of promise. There is a bit of a debate regarding the authorship and the composition of the document itself. And again, you have the well-known theory, J&E, writes 1 to 12, and then you have Mr. P, 13 to 21. And then there's also additions after the Deuteronomic history is completed, which is added to the book. Now, I always want you to remember, and I'm not trying to use that as an excuse, the Bible is not necessarily a historical account, although it does give us history in parts. It's a theological document. So that at times, some stories, the writers may even question the validity of certain stories or whether they existed or not, as we'll see at the end of, I think, the 3rd chapter, with regards when the 3 nations who lived on the east side of the Jordan set up a temple. There, for example, some of the students of the word is saying that is what we call midrash. It's a story used to make a theological point or to teach a specific lesson, doctrine. So it's the same like a parable. So it will be inserted to teach something specific at a certain point, and it may fit very well into the storyline. Right? So, however, the internal unity of the book militates against such analysis, that it is clear that it's not written by Joshua, okay? Because there is events after his death which is included in the book. However, this doesn't change the message of the book or the story of the book. Remember in the Pentateuch, although we say it's particularly ascribed to Moses, there is other writers as well. There's a compilation, like the same like I said to you with Chronicles. It's a compilation of various other books that they brought together. So the Bible, remember, is a theological document. Although there's history in parts which can be attested by archaeological evidence, there's also other parts which, like I said, is midrash or parable or fable that they use to give you a specific theological lesson or to teach you something about God or a principle. So keep that in mind always. That does not necessarily argue away some of the errors sometimes that we find, okay, but it does not take away from the message. The message in the Bible is consistent. They say it's a sequel to Deuteronomy rather than separate. a completely separate document. That's why they speak of what we call the Hexateuch instead of the Pentateuch. The Hexateuch will now include Joshua. Okay? And firstly, it's part of what we call salvation history. See, the success of the conquest was viewed as a result of obedience, Israel's dependence on the leadership and power of God. The same getting them there. They were dependent on the leadership and power of God, as we heard in the first lesson. So nothing changes. Even though the person on whom the Spirit rests and leads the people was the chosen person, or what we call advocate in between, who stands kind of in the gap here, which was Moses in Deuteronomy, and now it's Joshua. If you go back to the first lesson, you will see also in the first page 13 it says, it shows our doctrine and belief ought to be based on the events of sacred history. The stress is laid upon the relation of God to history. God is always active in our lives. He's active in our story, in His story. Then there's also the fidelity of God, the faithfulness of God, in other words. To fulfill His promise to the patriarchs. Go back to Genesis 12, 13 and 28, you'll see the promises made to the different patriarchs by giving to their descendants the land of Canaan. Contrast this with the Pentateuch. Here no laws are given. Right? The element of the story is that it's very direct. And I think of a book in the New Testament like that is perhaps Mark. Have you ever read Mark? It's to the point. He doesn't play around. He goes from one story to the next. There's no interlink in between. He just goes and. It's complete and it's done with speed. I mean, if you look at, just imagine the wars took between 5 to 7 years, I think. Yet you have the story crunched into 24 chapters, really. And in that you have the division of the land. Actually, the conquest is only 1 to 12. The division of the land is the rest of the book. So in 12 chapters you have the whole 5 to 7 years of war wrapped up into those 12 chapters. And at this day they camped at Abel Shittim. Here they are ready to advance. Moses is dead, and Joshua succeeded him as the new leader. And Joshua and Israel are assured possession of Canaan. Why? If they obey the Lord's commandments. It never changes. There is blessing when we are obedient. There is the general blessings to everybody because the sun shines on all of us. But then there's the special blessings that comes to us who are adopted in Christ Jesus. And then you have this title, or the commission, which is servant of the Lord. And this title was applied to Moses. And what is so beautiful is actually eventually applied to his successor. And we'll see that in the last chapter, in the third lesson, that eventually he too carries that title, servant of the Lord. And the quality that it stresses is obedience. You are a servant of the Lord. A servant obeys the commands given by the one in charge or over him. He does not question. That does not mean that you do not have a right to engage God. God in fact calls you to reason with Him. Like Moses sometimes reasoned with Him. If you think back on the story of Sodom and Gomorrah, God reasoned with him. That is not, what is it? That is not sacrilege. Remember, this is a relationship that you've entered into. So you may speak your mind. But you must remember when you're speaking to like Job, when he was reminded in chapter 14 onwards. Yeah. Where were you? Joshua is first of all the son of Nun, and Israel general at Amalek is the first time we hear of him. That's in Exodus 17. He's also Moses' lieutenant. Remember, he was the only one that sometimes joined Moses in the tent. of meeting. Jehoshua, Jehovah, that is the meaning. Jehovah is deliverance or salvation. Its Greek derivative is Jesus. There is some argument that the name might refer to a clan in Ephraim, but there is enough evidence to prove historically that he was an individual. Joshua proved a successful general with a deep faith and religious piety. I might come back to that just now, just to maybe hear your thoughts. It's the way the war is structured. I think there too, it's written also, yes, there's historical evidence for quite a bit of the events, but I also think it's given a certain order to prove a specific point. Joshua proved a successful general. Why? There was a deep faith in God and a religious piety. He was uncompromisingly faithful. Remember, he would stand before the nation at the beginning of his takeover and at the end, and he would remind them of where he stood before the Lord. And even if it meant that they would cower and not go with him, he made the decision, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. So he demanded from them exactly what he was standing for. And we have a right to do that if we are consistently faithful in these matters. Then we have a right, I do believe, to call on the congregation to reflect the same. We are not perfect, remember that, but we are all called to grow, even to consistently walk in those truths that we learn. Alright, still in the commission, in both the Pentateuch and Joshua, you have the borders of the land. Both of them will give you the borders of the land, and they fall into two categories. One is the ideal boundaries, verse 1 to 4, and that extends right down into Saudi Arabia, almost into the end. When we had the river of Egypt, at the top of Egypt, you have this river of Egypt running into the Negev area, which is the southern part of Israel. And in the time of Solomon, that border extended almost right down to the bottom end, beyond the river Egypt. But that was what they call the ideal boundaries. Then you have the actual boundaries, which is the river of Egypt. Then you have the Bear Mountain right in the top in the north, which extends to Arnon in the south, Lebanon in the north, and then you have the Valley of Mizpah, north to the source of the Jordan, and Mount Hermon on the east. And then obviously on the west you would have the Mediterranean Sea. The remainder of chapter 1 deals with preparations for crossing the Jordan. Now 3 days may be significant in some regard, but not necessarily. The only reason why it's possibly significant because there is the ceremonial aspects preceding the ritual crossing. There's this cleansing, the purification before they move across. And we'll get to that a little bit later. Here is what I want you to remember out of this lesson. There's quite a few things to remember, but this is one of the things that I want you to remember. Verse 17 of chapter 1 reflects one of the most tenacious characteristics of Israel's psychology, and that is to follow a spiritual leader. Now that is not different from the criteria as set up for deacons and for pastors and for leaders in the church. We are to be men full of the Spirit. When we choose men, if it's diaconate or leadership, orderland or whatever, they have to be men filled with the Spirit. They're not men that we like necessarily. They may be men that we do not necessarily like, but maybe that's because they lay us bare before the Lord. I'm listening often. It says, just as we obeyed Moses in all things, so we will obey you. Only may the Lord your God be with you as he was with Moses. They're setting exactly the same criteria as for the reason why they followed Moses. Let's go to chapter 2. Here you have the reconnaissance. They're going out to spy the land. And in particular you have what we call Rahab. You have Rahab the harlot, or a harlot. Now ancient Jericho was found near the well of Elisha. You remember Elisha? Northwest of modern Jericho. I don't have a photo now of that. I think about 5 miles west of Jordan. If you know where the Dead Sea is sitting, north of the Dead Sea. It was also called the City of Palms, and it was famed for its fertility. It was a land with rich soil. Okay? It also controlled access routes. And there's much archaeological evidence for all of what I'm saying now. So you see the importance of the city. And that is why this was the first one. Because people had to come in and out through it. God is very specific in the way he deals with things. His plans are always very specific. It's very detailed. When he gives an instruction, that instruction is detailed too. If you think just on how they had to put the ark together, it's detailed. The lamp and all of the things that had to go into the tent. Harlot is the Hebrew word for it is Zona, and the Targums and Jewish commentators connect Zona with Mason. Now, Mason simply means an innkeeper. So what you'd find possibly is that she may have been both. A harlot and an innkeeper at the same time. She might have been the mistress of the innkeeper, which was running the room. Remember, very important, she was also the ancestor of 8 prophets and priests, including Jeremiah, the weeping prophet. You also have the Amorites, which was a major element in the population. There were Semitic people. If you go at these 3, you did, not them. And then Rahab also assisted both with the protection and the escape of the spies. She did 2 things for them. She watched over them while they were there and spied out the land, and she helped with the escape. Why would she? Why do you think they would go to such a place in particular? And when I read this piece, I was thinking of movies. Because when people are looking information, where do they go? They go to all these slimy places. For want of a better word. Yeah, because everybody seems to know everybody and who's doing what. And they know all the bad things that's happening and where the good things are happening. They have access to information. And so, not only that, here they could be lost in the crowd. Because that's where generally people go. They want to get lost in the crowd. Nobody knows me now. Or if you go a few times to the same place, that won't be true anymore. Morton says, now we move to chapter 3, which is the crossing of the Jordan. Morton says, the crossing of the Jordan is regarded by the Deuteronomists as resulting from the action of God rather than the achievement of Israel. Now, you must also remember there's this story behind the Jordan where you have what we call the clay walls that possibly gave way and then caused a wall. So that's the one theory. But God has often used natural phenomena for his cause and for his sake. So whether it's the one or the other, both is seen as the action of God rather than the achievement of Israel. Also, what is different here is in the wilderness you had the pillar of fire that was leading them. Here you have more the permanent symbol of the ark of Yahweh, the ark of the covenant or testimony. And it holds a fourfold significance to them. One, it was the extension of the presence of God. It was also what we call a war palladium of the Israel Amphictyonim. If you remember, Amphictyonim is simply another word for the confederation, the 12 tribes, the confederation of the 12 tribes. It's just another word for it. A war palladium of the Israel Amphictyonim, more like a banner. It says, God is my banner. So this was their banner. In fact, each of the 12 tribes, when they were divided up into 3 groups, and they were going on their journey, remember they had the group leading in front, 3 at the back, 3 there after 3, each one had their own banner. If you go to the book to the Gospels, you will find those different banners. Jesus also being seen under those different banners. There's the one had a bull, the one had a lion, the one had a face of a man. There was a fourth one, I can't put my finger on it. And then there was also, remember, the gap between them of 1,000 yards, or 1,000, I think 1,000 yards. And it seems that the only reason for that was simply so that everybody could see where the ark was going. Because if they were close, they wouldn't know, they wouldn't be able to follow. More than trying to read something specific into it. But it was also a container for the 2 tablets of the Decalogue, Decalogue being the 10 Commandments. And then it was also the portable throne for the invisible presence of God. The king had a seat, and it was being carried. We also in the Mosaic tradition find the same witness for the ark. With Moses, you also had the ark already prior to this. However, during that particular period, it was the pillar of fire. There's always this foregoing of something before it realizes. In this case, it was the ark under Moses, in which we had what? 10 Commandments, and then what else was in there? The staff. Remember that, not the staff, but the rod with which budded. Then besides the Mosaic tradition which attested to the ark, the history of the ark, we also have the additional witnesses in Samuel, Joshua and Chronicles as well, and it quite what we call a colorful history. If you think about it, in addition, the Philistines gave witness to the dead origins of the ark that is on page 32. That's 1 Samuel 4:8. They gave witness to the desert origins of the ark. Then the ark, it was carried in the wilderness first of all. It was borne over the Jordan. It participated in the fall of Jericho. Remember, they had to carry it around Jericho 7 times. And was brought to Jerusalem by David. It was also captured by the Philistines. It was taken around the city every day for 7 days, and then the last day would be 7 times. And then you have that space for 1,000 yards that was to be maintained. Most scholars consider this a sign of reverence due to the ark. Others feel it was merely a way to ensure that all the people would be able to see the ark and follow accordingly. Sometimes things are just very practical. Sometimes you must read too much into it. Like the story that I told you of Ruth. The husband that went to another country because he was looking for work. So what we do is we read something into his name and we try to give it some meaning. And he was just being So it's similar principle. Don't read too much into things sometimes. Be careful when you're doing your exegesis. It's a naam betekent, open is a naam betekent. No one done market. No one done is it Bible language, and it makes sense within the confines of the context of the story, but not always. Then you in verse 10 you have the nations occupying Canaan. Verse 16. Let's go. The waters coming down from above stood and rose up in a heap very far away at Adam, the city that is besides Zaratan, and those flowing down toward the sea of the Arabah, the Salt Sea, were completely cut off, and the people passed over opposite Jordan. This is what I spoke about just now. Miracle or no miracle, whether the clay walls fell in and created what we call a dam wall and stopped the water from coming through. Israel regarded it as an act of God. And God uses the phenomena of nature for His own purposes. If you go back to the plagues, if you look at the first 4 or 5, the water turning into blood. If the water turns into blood, then it's almost natural for the frogs and those little other things to follow. But God uses them. Then thereafter, what happens thereafter is definitely different. It takes on a very different turn, because now God, those acts cannot be accounted for in our human reckoning, in our human minds. And then you have the last act that just blows you away. The first camp is at Gilgal, and here we have the 12 stones, which was also a Canaanite feature in their religion. Now there is some, the writer here, Pope, argues, let me just get to it please quickly. He says, it would seem unusual at the very outset of the conquest, Israel would adopt and adapt a pagan concept. The Gilgal stones had memorial and didactic purposes. And that I'm not going to dispute. What I am disputing is the statement that he makes, that it would seem unusual that at the very outset of Israel would adopt and adapt a pagan concept. And you'll see why I say so now. We'll just keep that in mind. It's 4:21 and 22. And he said to the people of Israel, when your children ask their fathers in time to come, what do these stones mean? Then you shall let your children know Israel passed over this Jordan on dry ground. So it was to teach and to be called to remembrance. The crossing caused panic amongst the kings already. Now this section comes to a close with a consistent declaration that it is God who is giving the land to Israel. Often if you go back into the history of Israel, you will hear the nations already, before Israel gets there, in their journey in the wilderness also. There would be nations saying, listen here, God has acted on their behalf, and they're already trembling before they get there. Now, in chapter 5, verses 2 to 15, there are 3 traditions are dealt with in this chapter. One is circumcision, then there's the Passover, and then there's a third one which we'll get to now. Now, circumcision was practiced by most Semitic people. The inauguration of circumcision amongst the Israelites is recorded in Genesis 17, and it was to be a sign of the covenant between God and Israel. But this act became necessary for participation in the Passover festival, which is the second tradition. It also means to differentiate between devout Jews and pagans. Now here's my question. He says Israel would not adopt and adapt the pagan concept. Circumcision was a pagan concept. Because most Semitic people practiced it. All I'm asking was saying, That's it. I'm saying sometimes that God will use what is cultural and give it to meaning. It's when we take those things out of context and give it its old meaning back. In this case, circumcision was to be a sign of the covenant between God and Israel. It was not necessarily only a physical sign.
Yeah.
It was a spiritual sign, something which they never fully understood. Because if you go back to Deuteronomy, what does God call them to do? To love Him and to obey Him. So that explains part of the covenant being made. And here is just a physical act which speaks to that covenant of love and obedience. That He would be their God and in return they would be doing something for Him. This act became necessary for participation in the Passover festival, as I said. It's also a means to differentiate between devout Jews and pagans. Significance of circumcision, physical, form of sacrifice. It was physical, like they said. It was also a form of sacrifice. Remember, it's the cutting off, it's giving part of your body back. Remember, there's the blood that is involved also. Then there's the initiation into the fraternity or into the nation. And then there's also the purification part. The physical part was merely more for health reasons than anything else. But here's the crunch. It was an ordinance of divine origin. Yes, it was practiced by everybody. But here the instruction is to this particular nation, this will be the sign of the covenant. It was not given to another nation in that sense. It was given to a particular nation, a particular people. This is the sign of the covenant. Blood had to be spilled.
If you ask now for the definition of circumcision, so must hold the 5 points.
All of those 5 points will be included.
So this is the definition of 5 points.
Remember the sacrifice? Is the sacrificing of the reproductive powers to a fertility deity. This was not probably the case for the Hebrews, so it was not performed by priests and altars or sanctuary was involved. So there's distinctions. If you go through the notes, that's the distinction, for example, if you look at the form of the sacrifice. There was no priest involved. There was no sanctuary involved. This was an act between you and God. No man had to stand in the gap in this case. So they, as much as the priests and the Levites were called to stand in the gap and to bring God's word to the people and to also make sure that they carry out the instructions of the Lord and the law. Here it's individual. Here is not a collective. Then it's an act of initiation into membership in the tribe or into the duties of manhood. And you have that initiation still here in South Africa, amongst quite a few of our black tribes. You still have that initiation. And it may have been a kind of tribal mark, though certainly not so. It's an ordinance of divine origin. It's an instruction by God to His people. Yeah. This will be the sign between us. Yeah. In their case, it's an initiation into manhood more than anything else. Because that period that they go into the bush for how many weeks?
15 weeks, 6 months.
Right. They have to build they have to build their own little hut and have to look after themselves. I don't
Where's the
think
food coming from?
The food,
I don't think they bring the food to them, but it's a form of hardship to produce something in particular. So for that full time, listen here, If it's cold at night, it's only you. It's dark, there's no light, there's nothing, you know. You're leaving your wealth behind. You're leaving your comfort behind. And it's a hard-hitting means of reflection, I suppose, where you sit and think about life and all that you've been taught. And now after that period, if you come through that period, that will initiate you into marriage. That's how I understand it. Circumcision also represented the removal of impurity. Therefore, it was an act of purification. And it was observed as an ordinance of divine origin and was to be an occasion for joy and rejoicing. When those boys go back here in South Africa, it's also that there's rejoicing. My son has become a man. The second tradition, which was the Passover. Passover meaning passing over or sparing. And celebration was twofold. They remembered the Exodus, obviously. God's hand in the Exodus. And then secondly, the dependence on manna to eat the produce of the land. Oops, I need to rewrite that sentence. There was this dependence on manna. Now they were going to eat the produce of the land. It's the moving from the one to the other. The Exodus is from slavery to freedom. The manna is given to them by God. Now they're going to produce their own food with the help of God. There's this theme of what I call new beginnings, of starting over. It's almost that kind of thing. In the wilderness, they couldn't plant. There was no soil to plant. There was no water to irrigate. The seasons all looked the same. It was just cold and hot. That was the only distinction. Now they're in the land, and it was going to produce food for them. There's evidence to support the idea that the Passover was also a pre-Exodus concept. So by the way, it being a nomadic shepherd, right? Remember, he's looking after the sheep. What it takes for him every day is his food, his bread, his dry bread, his unleavened bread. Unleavened bread, it just lasted longer. If you're being very practical, it lasted longer. And even unleavened bread had its origins as a Canaanite agricultural feast. And this is why I'm questioning why he's saying that. He's saying it was unusual at that point. But it's not unusual for them to adapt or to adopt and adapt a pagan ritual. It's not unusual for that to happen. He's saying it was unusual at that particular point in time for it to happen that way. So he has a bit of an issue with that. I don't. And then in Joshua 5, 13 to 15, you have what we call third tradition, which is called the offering. Now, God was understood to be genuinely present in an audible and visual way. In other words, you saw God and He was speaking to you in person. If you remember Gideon, that is what we might call a theophany. Then you had Abram with the 3 men coming to him. That also may be in some sense a theophany. It's almost as if God is coming down like, like He came down to the garden in Eden with Adam, and He came down to speak to him in the cool of the afternoon. So something similar to that. And when this happens, God discloses His will and gives a guiding hand. However, in this particular case, there's no divine instruction, as if the story is interrupted or perhaps lost. The setting of the story anticipates instructions for the capture of Jericho, but which is only given in the next chapter, verses 2 to 5. You see what the writers sometimes do? They use their skills in writing to produce a particular line of story to make a certain point. And so it might not necessarily be a specific order of things. And so keep that in mind sometimes. Because it says here, verses 2 to 5 of the next chapter contains the instructions. Whereas in that we often think, why didn't they give the whole story in one go? The writer doesn't do that. He doesn't see the necessity of it because he wants to make a different point. So he will maybe separate the two. So just keep that in mind when you're again doing exegesis. The conquest begins in chapter 6. During the conquest, Israel experienced victory and defeat, faithfulness and unfaithfulness. Characterized the response of Israel. Carried victories at Jericho and Ai, notwithstanding the disobedience of Achan. And then there's the treaty with the Gibeonites, a foothold gained in the central highlands. And that becomes very important. That treaty with the Gibeonites, even though there's disobedience, God uses our failure sometimes for good. And in this case, that was an important event. And the reason why, so you will see later, if that did not take place, it's possible that the south and the north would have come together in one go and taken on the nation of Israel, and they might not have been able to contain all of them in one go. But when that happens, you have the south being angered and stirred up and immediately coming after the Gibeonites. And that actually sets up Israel to defeat them. So there's the separation of the south and the north in the war because of that event. And now, the story of Achan is a very interesting one. And the one thing that I want you to remember in that story is this. In chapter 7, verse 19, then Joshua said to Achan, my son, give glory to the Lord, God of Israel, and give praise to him, and tell me now what you have done, do not hide it from me. When we speak truth, then we are praising. We are giving glory to God at that moment. We worship him. The fall of Jericho, it starts in chapter 6. Now, Archaeology attested that the walls of Jericho fell flat, including a fire. That's around about 1400. There's a disagreement between Armstrong and what's the other guy's name? Garstang and Albright. Yeah. The one Garstang says 1400, the other Albright says between 1375 and 1300. Then you have Bethel, Lachish and Deborah, which is in the 1800th century. Now, what happens in the book also, there's events thrown together, what happens over different periods of time. The Joshua narratives have brought together events which occurred at widely separated times. The use of the number 7 in the book, in this particular section, speaks to perfection or completeness. It's kind of difficult to attach meaning at times to its use again. I think Pope writes that specifically to warn us not to always attach meaning to the number 7 when we see it in a passage. It may have meaning in certain passages. Then there's the important festivals that I mentioned. There's the ordination, there's the consecration, victims for sacrifice, there's the number of altars, blood sprinkled, all of them 7. In this passage, however, it stresses the ritual nature of the march around Jericho. There's the ritual plus 7, which helped the Israelites understand, the number 7, that the victory over Jericho was the work of God. So the number here is used for a specific purpose. We also have in verses 17 to 19 the word cherem, which is the last rite of the Holy War. Now remember, all was devoted to destruction. Everything was devoted to destruction, to the deity who gave victory. And it It was an act of gratitude to their God.
So it's just the meaning
To God,
the
yes.
last rite of the
Yeah, it's the last act of the Holy War. When we've done killing the people, we destroy the rest. Everything is destroyed. You have on account sometimes when they took some of the gold and silver that was taken to the sanctuary.
Never for themselves.
Never for themselves. Never for your own use. That is why you have the story of Achan in between, who took some of the devoted, took things devoted to destruction. It was devoted to the Lord, in fact. That's another way of putting it. It was devoted to the Lord. Verse 22 to 25, and come the rescue of Raham's household. And then you have the conquest of Ai, which is very interesting because it says that the city was originally destroyed in 2200 BC and only occupied again in 1000 BC. However, archaeology tells us that the remaining occupants moved 1.5 miles west and then built Bethel. So Ai was destroyed in 1250, so you have what we call Bethel Ai. And then in Judges you have the story in 1:22-26 that tells you the destruction of Bethel. So it's just that it moved slightly because history tells you that it was destroyed in 1000 BC. However, the remaining occupants just moved 1.5 miles west, and that is the town that's been destroyed. Now, Ai was demoralizing to them, but it was eventuated because Israel was unfaithful in the matter of devoted things. But they were also unfaithful in that they didn't ask God before they went up to war. They did not. They did not go and ask Him. Remember, every time they went up to war, if you go in the story of Moses, as he led them, before they go up to war, they would speak to God about it. They would consult Him. Yes, there was consultation here. See also the doctrine of collective responsibility, something we don't exercise today very much. Corinthians writes the arm is hurting and the rest of the body is hurting. But that is not collective responsibility. It merely refers to the fact that everybody is affected by the one person's disposition. Alright? Whether it's hurting or whether it's sin, in this case it's sin, there's this collective responsibility. One man sins, the trespass was ascribed to the nation. Just need to take that characters out there. Joshua was called to find out I read to you how he addressed him. And then pass sentence over him. They were taken to the valley of Achan, where the ground just gave way under them. And he and his whole family and everything, all that he owned was taken up. Again, you see what happens here? All is devoted to destruction. Not only Achan, but he and his whole family is devoted to destruction. They are devoted to destruction. And then in chapter 8, verses 4 to 8, you have the battle plan. Verses 9 to 25, it's implementation, and it's like it's to the T, it's military procedure, as you call it. And then the ceremony that follows in 30 to 35. The insertion of the ceremony, though strange, seems to indicate that Deuteronomy is concerned that at the earliest juncture, Joshua initiated a covenant renewal ceremony. Alright? Then you have the peace treaty that follows. I'm going to have to move a little faster now. I'm going to 27. Again, like with Ai, the Israelites need to consult God before entering into the treaty. But there's also a very important thing in this part, which is called the sanctity of an oath. Rightfully or wrongfully, an oath was taken. And remember, you can't go back once an oath is made. Remember I can't remember now what it was, the oath that he made, that the first person that comes out of his house will be devoted to the Lord. And then it is his daughter.
Yeah.
So an oath cannot be broken. However, in the law, there is a part which says if a woman made an oath, that the man within a specified time could recall that oath, if he knew about it. However, the Gibeonites is still punished. They not let off the hook. And the story here, simple, is that honesty in life is generated by faithfulness to God. The Gibeonites lied, they were full of treachery, and they got their due reward. They would serve them for the rest of their lives. They would become their servants. This conquest tradition leaves the impression of a swift campaign commanded by Joshua, resulting in the destruction of Canaan's capacity for cooperative resistance. Pockets of resistance remained for a while after the struggles were completed. Then you have the southern campaign. Now, this is just after the Gibeonite. What happens is the Amorite coalition forms because they want to punish the Gibeonite for his treachery. Rather than saying to themselves, let's join up with the north and have one big army. Now they're angry and they act upon that anger and they go after the Gibeonites. However, they're surprised and they flee before the Israelites. And you have this massacre at Beth Horon. You have the hailstones, and then also very important, you have what we call Joshua's long day. Now there is, I did not have time to go to the internet to get you the story. Group of scientists measuring time, and when they measured time, they found that there was one day missing. So they were looking for the 24 hours. Now, this, if you go to the passage, it will tell you that it was almost a full day. It's very specific. If you go and read the line there, it will tell you it's almost a full day. And if you go to, and they worked it out, when they worked out the time, it was 23 hours and 20 minutes. So they were looking for 40 minutes. And guess where they found it? One of the scientists in the group told them about this day. So they went to measure it, and it was 23 hours and 20 minutes, I think. Then they were looking for the 40 minutes. And I think the story says that he came a day or two later and said to him, listen, I think I know where the other 40 minutes is. You remember the king that asked for his life to be extended? And the clock moved on the things, it moved 40 minutes. In terms of how they explain it there and the terminology used, it's the 40 minutes that they were looking for.
And King Ezekiel.
Extended his life.
Yeah.
He also.
Yes, he was given 10 or 15 years ago.
15 years.
Yeah.
But the clock actually moved back and the shadow moved. Now there was this clock or dial that they used.
Yes.
Now the reading explains that it moved a certain part. The shadow moved a certain part. And that moving was exactly for 40 minutes in our time. Yeah, interesting. This event attaches itself to that supernatural process in which God had been engaged ever since the deliverance of his people from Egypt until we settled in the land. Jordan, Jericho, the long day. All of them speak to God's hand. Seek divine counsel always, and the reward will follow. Make supplication in all things, yes, Paul. It confirms that truth and that word given in the Old Testament. And you have the northern campaign. After a short respite, there wasn't much rest for them. That's the victory at Gilgal then there's the victory at Gilgal over Adonai-Zedek and his compatriots. You have Jacob, king of Hazor in the north that calls for the confederacy of northern kings. Yeah, the same thing happened. Joshua surprises the coalition armies by the waters of Merom and utterly defeats them. The wars last about 5 to 7 years. The only reason why they win was obedience to God's commandments. In summary, Israel had a strong view of the sovereignty of God. Often the freedom of man is subjugated to divine determination. And when this happens, the response of men are not clearly distinguishable from the sovereign acts of God. I wanted to go to that, but we don't have lots of time. Then you have the Anakim in Hebron, the giants, remember Anakim? Those were giants who Caleb drove from their city. And then 12 is a conclusion of the history of the conquest. Not all the cities they defeated was occupied. The conquest is completed in chapters 10 to 12. Jerusalem and Gaza only came into Israel's possession long after the conquest, according to 2 Samuel 5, 6 and 9. And you also have the kingdoms of Sion and Og allotted by Moses to tribes of Reuben, Gad and East Manasseh. Remember, after they slew them, that was in the east of the Jordan, those three tribes, or at least half of Manasseh, decided that is where they wanted to remain. The success of the conquest was the result of Israel's obedience to and dependence on the leadership and power of the Lord who gave the victory. The Gibeonite event proved a turning point in the war, and it allowed for separate defense against the south. So the Gibeonite event is an odd one, but also an amazing one, because it separates the south from the north in the war. Now we have chapter 3. Here we have the division of the land. This is the second half of Joshua. This is chapter 13 to 24. It's split exactly into two halves, 12 chapters each. This is what we call the second major section of Joshua. And then chapters 2 and 24 is the third section of the book, actually. 13 to 19 consists mainly of tribal boundaries and city lists. You have the city of refuge, cities of refuge in 20, Levitical cities in 21, and then the farewell address of Joshua in 23. Again, you have them ascribed to either D or E or P as the writers. And 24 records an ancient tradition of covenant ceremony and shechem. It's certain among the geographical list of chapters are narrative passages, and much of this material is paralleled in Judges 1. Okay, so the primary allotment is in chapter 13 to 17. Chapter 13 and 14 are just an introduction to the actual land division and the inheritance of the Trans-Jordan tribes is recorded here. Caleb receives the land promised to him. In chapter 15 there's the allotment to Judah. Chapter 16 to 7 discuss the allotment to the Joseph tribes. Many Judah, Joseph, and then Caleb's story is also inserted in between. In verses 1 to 7 of chapter 13, there's the introduction to the second major division of the book. Here God commands Joseph to apportion land west of the Jordan among the 9 1/2 tribes that had not yet received an inheritance. Verses 2 to 6 the unconquered territories, including the region of the Philistines. And that is important to remember, because the book that follows Judges now speaks to that issue of the unconquered territories and the terrible harm that it caused to them. Because although the point is that they obeyed the commands of the Lord under Joshua, that is the point of the book, there is things that they also did not do and complete, because after Joshua died, there's still territories to be gained and conquered, but they do not complete that. A man is gone, now suddenly they stop. And then there's this key refrain in Judges which says, and there was no king. And everybody did as they thought good in their own eyes, because there was no leader, there was no follow-up after Joshua. In verses 8 to 33, you have the eastern tribes, Reuben, Gad, part of Manasseh. Then you have the Levites. Now remember, the Levites never get any territory allotted to them. The word of the Lord is clear. The Lord is your inheritance. The Lord is your reward. He will take care. When the people do not bring their tithe and their offering, He will take care of you still. When they rob the Lord, then He will 14, you have the division of Western Palestine, and then inserted is the fulfillment of the promise made to Caleb. The experience of Caleb is meant to be an example of God's faithfulness to those who completely follow Him. 35 years later, they say that promise was fulfilled. Then you have the allotment of Judah. Now remember when Israel gave his blessing over the sons, there was two specific blessings. In this case, Judah had the blessing of dominion, and Joseph had the double portion. Judah would receive his allotment in the southern part, Joseph their allotment in the northern part. And the rest of the chapter lists cities grouped according to administrative districts. Then you have the allotment to the Joseph tribes. Ephraim and Manasseh, don't forget, constitute the tribe of Joseph. That's the sons of Joseph, Ephraim and Manasseh. So it's one tribe, but it's two clans with one tribe. The daughter of Zedekiah received land in accordance with the decision attributed to Moses regarding inheritance rights in sonless families. Remember, there was women who did not, women weren't really seen, they were seen as property of men, and they really had no rights. Now, Pope stands still for a while to deal with this issue. I don't think it sits well with him also, because it's a strange and odd thing to find this in the Bible. But God deals with those issues, because the daughter of Zedekiah who comes and asks for land understands how the law works. I think she understands how to be fair. Otherwise, she would never come and ask. Now, Moses decided that already in Deuteronomy, when he said if there was no sons, then the daughters would receive it. So he already interpreted the law and made known to them that there was to be parity, there was to be equality. And remember, the son God, whoever was still in the home would still be under his care and protection. So the daughters would still be under his care and protection. The Old Testament only presents women as the property of men, which have no rights. There's the list of famous places inside the allotment to Ephraim. For example, you have Ramah, which is Samuel's city. You also have Arimathea, or Ramah was later called Arimathea in the New Testament, the place where Jesus was buried. You also have the Samaritan woman and Jesus at Jacob's well in Sychar. They received, like Judah, rich and large areas of land. God expected them to fight and work for their gain by the sweat of their brows. They would enjoy the produce, but from the beginning and under the curse it was said you would toil by the sweat of your brow. So that curse was still in place. Funny, eh? Being blessed, but still under this curse. Joseph was assured of success in expelling the Canaanites and settling the forest of the hill country. Then you have the secondary allotment, second allotment. The first allotment was at Gilgal. This, however, shifts to the remaining 7 tribes at Shiloh, where the tabernacle is located. The 7 remaining tribes, first of all, they are reproved by Joshua for their lack of zeal in settling their future homelands. And so what he does is, in order to get around this lack of zeal, he devises a plan to allow the 7 tribes to have part in the division of the land. And he chooses 3 men from each tribe, who forms or constitutes a commission. They then go out and survey the land, and they are called then to divide this land into 7 parts. What Joshua does after that is to cast lots at the tabernacle, determine what tribe receives which portion. Okay? Simeon, even though they received their allotted portion, was later absorbed into the tribe of Judah. And Joshua, in accordance with his character, he's the last one to choose his inheritance. And his inheritance is close to the tabernacle. Remember, he had grown up with Moses at the tent of meeting, at the place where they met with God. And so he chooses the same for himself in the sense. You then have what in this particular section, you have the special cities, there's the cities of refuge. Now, without looking at your notes, what can you tell me about the cities of refuge? Sorry?
The cities of refuge.
Yeah. What did that have to do with? Yes, that's right. If there was what we call manslaughter or intentional killing, then this is a place where you would run to. No, that didn't mean that you would not necessarily be in trouble if it was intentional. So it was connected with the ancient custom of blood revenge, meant as a safeguard against manslaughter, a distinction between intentional and accidental slaying, and a restraint also against private vengeance. It served two purposes. One, to shelter the accused until his case could be heard and acted upon by proper judges. Jy staan miskien bo op die huis, and you knock off a stone, falls on somebody's head. There was no intention to kill the person. So now somebody in that family could take revenge on you. So what you could do is to run to these cities, and they would offer you shelter until such time that they could determine whether you were guilty of either manslaughter or it was an intentional. You had every intent to murder.
So if it was not intentional, then
they would immediately take you out of the city and hand you over to the appropriate authorities for sentence.
Oh.
Immediately. So you couldn't really hide. But it was also a place of safety from the avenger in the case of accidental death. If it was accidental death, then you would live in the city until the death of the high priest, and then you were free to leave. And they couldn't touch you after that. If you died before the high priest died, they would simply take your bones and remove it from the city and go and bury it somewhere else. Because remember, it was not allotted to the Levites, but it was rather, it was set aside for them to inhabit, but it was never theirs. Now you had 6 cities, each in the north, the central part of Canaan or Israel, and then in the south, simply for easy access for the whole nation. So if you were in the south, you didn't have to run to the north to get away. Then you had what we call the Levitical cities, and now remember, I said there was no allotment. The Lord was the inheritance. There was 48 cities set aside for the Levites to inhabit. 13 of the 48 were set aside for the children of Aaron, which was what we call priestly cities. Remember, you had the priests and the Levites. The Levite would receive from the tithe and from the sacrifices, and then from that they would again tithe to the priests. In our cases, the minister gets his money first. There's no Levites. In Joshua's time, the local sanctuaries were closed, and the Levites were eventually moved to Jerusalem because of what we call centralized worship. So they would go up to Jerusalem once a year to go and take their offerings or their tithe. Year 2, they received the appropriate share of first fruits and sacrifices because everything came to Jerusalem. Previously, you could take it to your local sanctuary. Now, there was one place of worship to which they were going up to. You read verses 43 and 45, it concludes the second major division of the book of Joshua. Says, and then it says, Thus the Lord gave to Israel all the land that he swore to give to their fathers, and they took possession of it. And they settled there. The Lord gave them rest on every side, just as they had sworn to their fathers. But one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. Not one word of all the good promises that the Lord had made to the house of Israel had failed. All came to pass. It says here, these verses encompass all that has gone before. The covenant promises of the Lord have been realized, given to us in 1:16. Israel had possessed the land of promise in 11:23, we saw in Joshua. They settled in it, that is in 1949 to 50, and received the promised rest, given to them in 11:23b. The enemies had not been able to withstand them, according to 1:5. In a magnificent concluding statement, the author affirms the Lord's faithfulness to all his good promises. All came to pass. Occupation is concluded in chapter 22. The Transjordan tribes faithfully fulfilled their commitment. And what was the commitment that they made? Reuben, Gad, and the half tribe of Manasseh. What was the commitment that Joshua kept them to it? Why are they only now going to live there?
It's not because of obedience.
Yes, it is because of obedience, but what was their promise that they made? You remember?
They will honor the God, our God, their God.
Yeah, they did that. But what did they commit to? They committed to waging war with them until all was completed. The instructions Joshua gave right at the beginning, they said they would hold to it. Remember when they defeated the nations, the kings of Sihon and Og? They said this is what they want. Then Moses said to them, listen guys, this is what you want, you can have it. However, we're going into the land of Canaan and to wage war, to take what God has promised us. You will have to hold to that commitment. And make sure that only once that war has been waged and God has carried us through, then you will return to them. Now it's quite possible that their wives and children stayed there. Then they went to war with the nation of Israel. We were released to return home east of Jordan and remained obedient to the Lord. 1034, you get the erection of an altar by the East Jordan tribes. Now, they were accused by Israel of setting up a rival worship centers or whatever it is. They sent down a committee led by Phineas. And when they got there to investigate, these guys sat down with them and said, listen guys, this altar was not built for worship, so we're not trying to rival you. This is merely for a witness concerning the unity of the entire Israelite nation and the access of all members to the sanctuary of God. And the dispute was settled. Luckily somebody kept his cool, as Pope says, and went to go and first ask, listen, why did you do this? They just didn't go in fighting like the Amorites who wanted to take out the Gibeonites. They went to go and ask first. And what is really important to remember, the lessons that are supposed to be learned from this particular passage, is that the absolute importance, or the lessons that the Hebrews learned in this particular passage, is the absolute importance of the worship of one God at one sanctuary. The utter folly of idolatry, the importance of seeing both sides of the Jordan as the Lord's land. Very interesting comment. Because according to the Israelites, only that land which was given to them was the Lord's land. here the truth is here the truth is revealed, to say to them, listen guys, whether we are in that land or outside of the land, who created the heavens and the earth? It says the earth is the Lord's and the fullness thereof. So we're always in the Lord's land, because He's always present. The story may be inserted merely to make a point, and this is what I said to you earlier. Midrash, like a parable, a story is designed to illustrate and enforce a religious teaching. Then you have this Pharaoh 23 and 24. The first Pharaoh address of Joshua is filled with Deuteronomic spirit, says the writer, language and point of view. And the parting words in ancient days were highly regarded, as you see in the case of Jacob too, and in the case of Moses. Parting words is highly regarded because it also carries blessing. There's the main themes of what God has done, what you must do, or Israel must do, and what God will do. There's an appeal to remembrance, and Moses does exactly the same thing in his last address. There's first the appeal to remembrance. And sometimes when we're down and out, then you always sit down and think about the past. Go and think about what God has done and remember His acts in your life, the role it has played in your life, and where He has brought you to, how He got you there, before you decided what the future is going to look like. Remember how God helped you. The key word in all of this again is obedience. There's also the providence of God. This is how I like to explain the providence. God knows the beginning, the middle, and the end. Most people will tell you the beginning and the end. Remember that He knows the beginning, the middle, and the end. Because a story doesn't only have a beginning and an end, it has a middle too. The in-between, where life is difficult, and we're smart, and we're jostling just to make ends meet, and die nacht ligt donker. It looks like morning will never come. God is there. God is faithful. God provides. He's made promises. Remember, He can, and He will perform it. God carries out all the promises He made to them. Then you have the covenant ceremony at Shiloh. Verses 2 to 13 is summaries of God's acts to the patriarchs, the deliverance from Egypt, and then also the occupation of Canaan. And then in verse 12, called the hornet. Now, there's two theories here. It's either the softening of Canaan by the Egyptians prior to the conquest. So there would have been skirmishes of war between them, and the Egyptians softened them up for the Israelites before they came in. Or it could be an actual plague of hornets that God sent. The point simply is that God conquered the promised land, and it was not on the strength and wisdom of Israel. It is never our strength and wisdom. It is the strength and wisdom of our Lord. How does Ephesians say it? Finally, be strong in the Lord and in the strength of His might. That's in chapter 6. Peter says to him, His divine power, as in 2 Peter 1:3, His divine power has granted to us all things that pertain to life and godliness. So we're dependent on the strength and the power of God, but also dependent on the wisdom of God. James reminds us clearly, if we go back to Solomon, the first thing he asked for was wisdom. He could have asked for wisdom, he asked for wisdom. And out of wisdom came riches. James says to us, if you ask, Ask for wisdom. Don't ask for anything else, ask for wisdom. Verses 14 to 15, Joshua makes an altar call. And it also speaks to the nation's response. It also makes a very clear point with regarding to free choice on the matter of life and death. Choose. You must choose. He came that all may be saved. Therefore, there is this choice needs to be made. A covenant is struck, and the essential of that covenant are etched upon a large stone for posterity. And then in chapter 23, also you have 24 verses 29 to 33, you have your three burial traditions. Verses 29 to 31, Pope Righteous identical with Judges 2, 7 and 9. Then you have the importance of Shechem, where Joseph's bones were also laid to rest. And Joshua received the exalted title of servant, like his predecessor in mentor Moses. Under the leadership of Joshua, Pope writes, the Israelites remained steadfast and faithful to the task. And they saw victory, they saw results, they saw reward. How does one assess the influence of a man such as Joshua, writes Pope? In his widespread influence, Joshua exhibited strength of character. He exalted the honor of God, stripping himself of all pretense. He displayed a deference to the law of God. He showed complete dependence on the strength of God. His trust in God's faithfulness was unwavering.